Moscow's foreign policy priorities at this time are linked to the government's central policy item, and that's modernization. And they started looking at foreign policy more as a resource for the modernization effort inside Russia. And since this modernization at this point is largely about technology imports and innovation, this calls for much closer relations with the countries that can provide that, which means the countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and that means the West, basically. And in this sense, the United States is very much at the top of the list due to its technological prowess. And the Russian leadership at this point tries to reach out to the U.S. and Europe primarily to help the Russian government with their modernization projects back home. But this is a new addition, if you like, to the more traditional foreign policy priorities set, which includes, and basically modernization even is a tool to reassert Russia's position and role in the world as a major power, as a major player. And they recognize that without new technologies, without essentially a new economy, the country has very little chance of staying in the top league. The U.S.-Russia relations at this point are certainly at a pretty advanced stage in terms of the reset that was announced in 2009. The relationship is moving upward. It has a few things under its belt, including the New START treaty, yet to be ratified, of course. There are a few other things. There's far less friction between the United States and Russia in a number of areas. There's a measure of collaboration on issues such as Iran and Afghanistan. There's talk about collaboration on an issue as sensitive as missile defense. So there's a lot that that has gone right for the relationship in the last 18 months. However, there are other things that bode ill for the relationship unless they've been dealt with properly. The spy scandal, I think, points to a couple of things. On the Russian side, I believe it points to the persistent culture in the intelligence community and more broadly in the Russian government of trying to get intelligence information about things that could be researched and assessed through open channels. In other words, many people at the top of the Russian government, given their former background, would only trust things that come to their desks in a folder marked top secret or from very reliable sources, etc. They would not reach out for a copy of the New York Times instinctively, or they would not surf the internet in search for news and analyses, but rather they would trust the more traditional Cold War-ish channels of communication. So that's a problem on the Russian side. I think a major cultural problem. Somehow people will have to deal with that. It also points to a couple of things here, I believe, in the U.S. And one of those things is that we talked about reset, but there are serious people in Washington who believe that the reset has gone wrong, that the United States has given too much to Russia, that Russia has not thanked the United States properly, that the agreements signed between Washington and Moscow are to Washington's disadvantage. And these people believe that it's the right time to push another button, to just slow down this reset, because it's not been very advantageous from those people's point of view. So that's another thing that you have to deal with in Washington. Europe falls into the same category as the United States in the sense that that's the technologically advanced group of nations. They're also much closer geographically and historically to Russia than the United States. So in a way, that's the principal engine for Russian modernization. If you really want to put modernization at the top of your agenda, Europe is your most important strategic partner. The problem with Europe is that it's not very united on many issues, and it's not very united on Russia. So Russia has excellent relations with a few countries, with quite a few countries actually, but with countries such as Germany and France and Italy, it has excellent relations all around. With other countries, such as Poland and the Baltic states, the relations are marred by the experience of the Cold War and what preceded the Cold War, Soviet domination. And I think that the Russians have realized that unless they manage to improve relations with Poland, above all countries, they will not have a normal relationship with the European Union as a whole. And that is behind the drive on behalf of Moscow toward a better relationship. We're dealing with a very diverse group of nations, but they see themselves as independent states. Not a single one wants to be seen as part of somebody's zone of influence. Perhaps the best illustration of that is the refusal of all Russia's neighbors from the former Soviet Union to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And this has nothing to do with Georgia, nothing to do with Abkhazia or South Ossetia. It has everything to do with how those countries want to be seen by the outside world and how they see themselves. So this talk about zone of influence, zone of privileged interests is largely talk. There's not a single country that would fall into that zone, in my view. But relations with those countries are very different because, again, we're dealing with a very, very diverse group of nations. Moscow has been trying to increase its influence in those countries, has been trying to promote its interests in all of those countries, and in some cases it succeeded, but never and nowhere to the extent that would put those countries into a category of satellites or countries with limited sovereignty or something like that. Ukraine is a case in point. Ukraine, which used to be under the previous leadership of President Yushchenko, used to be headed firmly toward the West, is now rebalancing its foreign policy. It still, in my view, is headed toward Europe, the European Union being the eventual station for Ukraine, or eventual goal for Ukraine. But this leadership, unlike its predecessor, also sees the importance of having a good relationship with Russia. So Ukraine is now engaged in some kind of a balancing act, which is a far more complex policy, but which is than the previous one, but a policy which I think also addresses the key interests of Ukraine. Missile defense is an issue that will have a major impact on U.S. Russian relations, first of all. Let me put it this way, it could be a major issue of contention between the United States and Russia, say around 2020, when the United States will have advanced much further along the path of building missile defenses. And Russia will be in a much weaker strategic position in terms of its aging nuclear weapons arsenal. People in Russia are saying that U.S. advances in missile defense actually put Russia's strategic independence at risk, basically by holding out the prospect of a first strike that would wipe out the Russian nuclear arsenal. So this is one way in which missile defense can have an impact on the relationship. The other option, which is now being discussed, is U.S. Russian collaboration on missile defense, whether at the regional level or theater level in Europe, that would include also the countries of Europe, NATO, or at the global level, or both. Frankly, if you ask me about something that could be a game changer in the strategic relationship between the United States and Russia, I would say it's not more START. It's not new START. It's collaboration on missile defense, because that, in a strict technological way, that makes it impossible to regard the other party as a potential military adversary. You have your defenses linked and integrated, and that simply does away with the threat of nuclear attack. If the two countries managed to collaborate on that issue, that would outweigh that would make arms control irrelevant. We will have put arms control behind us. Arms control only regulates enmity or residual enmity. Strategic and even theater missile defense collaboration is a way to the future. This is, if you like, this is a functional equivalent of NATO membership for Russia. And I'm gratified to note that the current NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, has been very vocal in his support for Russian-NATO collaboration on a joint missile defense program. But having said that, I fully recognize the immense difficulties of proceeding down that road. Technological, perhaps least difficult, but psychological, political, there's a whole massif of distrust that includes both the U.S. establishment and the Russian establishment. So it's very much an uphill battle. It requires bold, courageous leadership. But again, in my view, no amount of strategic nuclear arms reductions will transform the relationship. It's only through collaboration on strategically important issues that that relationship could be transformed. Russia's change of position on Iran had a lot to do with two things. Russia's attitude toward the policies of the Iranian leadership and Russia's attitude toward the policies of the Obama administration. As far as the Iranian leadership is concerned, I think that the Russians were irritated by the fact that Tehran refused to reach out for a deal, the best possible deal that Tehran could have had from the international community. That deal was supported by Russia, among other players, and it was actively promoted by the United States. So if Iran was looking for a deal, now was the time, or last fall was the time to clinch that deal. And under the Bush administration, a very powerful argument could be built that a compromise between Iran and the international community was made impossible by the hardline policies of the Washington administration. Now those hardline policies have been changed. So if people in Iran wanted to have a deal, it was there for the asking. So the Russians believe that since Iran failed to reach out for that deal, it had something else up its sleeve, and it had ambitions that truly are not consonant with Russian national interests. Russia cannot feel happy about Iran becoming a nuclear weapons state armed with long-range missiles. Secondly, there's been a change in the Russian assessment of the U.S. administration. Previously, when George Bush was the president of the United States, they thought that sanctions resolutions were nothing but a pretext for an eventual attack by the United States or the United States and Israel against Iran. So all those documents that the United Nations Security Council was churning out would only serve as justification at the end of the day of a military strike. Now they see the Nobel Peace Prize laureate as not wishing to initiate a strike against Iran. They see him as actually interested in a compromise deal with Iran. And thus, he is seen as much more of a bona fide partner at the UN than his predecessor was. So because of those two things, two reassessments, this reassessment of the Iranian position and the reassessment of the U.S. position, the Russians have changed somewhat their stance on the sanctions. Russia's relations with China are only second to Russia's relations with the United States and Europe. But if you look at Europe as a collection of states, then China comes a close second after the United States as far as countries are concerned from the Russian standpoint. It's an immensely important relationship. Russia has a long border with China. And Putin, as president, believed that his biggest foreign policy achievement was fixing every inch of the Sino-Russian border. And that speaks volumes about the relationship and the way the relationship is viewed from Moscow. Today, the relationship is perhaps the best it's ever been. Essentially, it's friendly. There's a lot of economic intercourse. The Chinese and the Russians travel across the border with minimal formalities. Lots of Chinese in Russia, lots of Russians in China. It's also a co-equal relationship, at least outwardly. But the problem for the Russians is that they are yet to adjust to a strong China. During the previous 300 years, and that is more or less the time when Russia and China had been in contact, from the late 17th century until the end of the Soviet Union. Russia had always been in the ascendancy. It was almost always the senior partner. At times it dominated China, or parts of China. And as far back as 1990, Chinese and Russian GDP were equal. Now there's a factor of 4 in favor of China. And that all happened, this dramatic change happened within less than a decade in the 90s. And physically, say 20 years ago, you would travel across the Sino-Russian border and you would see modern, if dilapidated, structures on the Russian side and essentially traditional villages on the Chinese side. Now you see the glitzy skyscrapers on the Chinese side and the decrepit buildings on the Russian side, which have grown 20 years older. And it's one of the most striking and dramatic changes in relations between any two major countries in modern history. As China grows, Russians are asking the question, how will China behave in the new environment, and what it means to Russia? Whether China will essentially become a magnet for Russian provinces in the Far East and Siberia that would simply gravitate to China, or whether the Chinese will send more people to settle down in those territories. They're serious questions. Some of them are naive and some of them are unfounded. But certainly there's a new concern how Russia can deal with a strong China. There's no good question to that. I mean, no good answer to that. There's some notional answers, very abstract, that Russia should be. But how? How can Russia rebalance that relationship? That's going to be one of the bigger challenges of the 21st century for Russia. Moscow's been mercurial, unfortunately, on the WTO issue. Putin wanted very much, while he was president, to clinch the deal. And he was denied that, in his mind, unfairly, by the harsh conditions that the outside world posed before Russia. So he, when he stepped down or stepped aside as president, he felt bitter about the whole WTO thing. Then, of course, comes the crisis. And since the crisis so much bolstered the protectionist trends in all countries, including, of course, in Russia, they decided in the Kremlin to put the emphasis on the regional grouping with Kazakhstan and Belarus, known as the Customs Union, and put the WTO thing on the back burner because the implementation of the WTO would have added, not much, but would have added something to the problems that Russia would have to deal with as a result of the crisis. Now with the reassessment of many things in Russia and with this new modernization agenda, the WTO has been seen as an instrument of modernization. Not enough, in my view. I think it should be really at the top of the agenda as the principal vehicle of Russian economic modernization. But in any event, it has been upgraded. I believe that both the Russians and Russia's partners in the U.S. and Europe primarily do not see the WTO thing in the right light. They on both sides, Russia and its partners, that is, they view it as an agreement about the terms of trade. Whereas it should be seen by the Russians, as I said, as a vehicle for modernization. And by the partners of the Russian Federation, it should be seen as a vehicle for integrating Russia into the global economic system. So the political importance of the WTO, in my view, is clearly being downgraded by both sides, and that is a pity. I very much hope that at the end of the day, and sooner rather than later, Russia becomes a member of the WTO, enters the world of the normative, and lets the WTO work for modernization inside Russia. There are many differences between Russia and the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union acted abroad, it normally spent money, spent treasure and lives sometimes in pursuit of some global political ideological interest. When Russia is acting beyond its borders, it is primarily out there looking for profit, looking for money, looking for deals. In that sense, Russia is ultra-pragmatic in its foreign economic policies. It stopped being a donor for some of its neighboring countries. And let me put it this way. One of the reasons, or perhaps the primary reason, why there is no economic integration around Russia, why Russia is not the center of some economic union, economic confederation of former Soviet states, is the fact that the Russian government doesn't want to pay for that. I mean, Europe, the European Union, was actually built with German money and German subsidies. Germany was at the center of it all. Russia doesn't want to be a center of it all. Russia wants influence. Russia wants assets. Russia wants a lot of things in other countries, but Russia doesn't want to pay for that. So that's the thing. Sometimes Russia's foreign economic adventures are questionable. I think that some dealings with Venezuela are vulnerable on economic grounds. So that means that they have a political connotation that distorts the economic game.